Hargrove Grand Hotel ballroom had seen 100 engagements, a dozen wedding receptions, and one very public meltdown that the staff would whisper about for years. But on the night that Lena Marsh walked in wearing a burgundy dress that cost her 3 weeks of overtime pay, none of that history mattered. What mattered was the man standing at the podium, the man she had spent 4 years building a life with, and the way he looked at her like she was a problem he'd finally solved. His name was Derek Weston. He was 34, handsome in the sharp-jawed country club way, and he had a gift for making cruelty sound like concern. "Ladies and gentlemen," Derek said into the microphone, adjusting his cufflinks with the practiced ease of someone who had rehearsed this moment, "I have an announcement." Lena was still near the entrance, still shaking the rain from her coat, still smiling because she genuinely thought that this was the surprise he'd hinted at for weeks. A promotion at his firm, maybe. An announcement about their future. The room was full of people she knew, colleagues from Hargrove Capital where she worked in data analytics, neighbors from their apartment building, friends of Derek's family who had always greeted her with a specific brand of warmth reserved for people they felt sorry for. "I've realized," Derek continued, "that I've been settling." The word landed like a stone dropped into still water. Lena watched the ripples move through the room, heads turning, eyebrows lifting, glasses paused halfway to lips. "I've spent 4 years trying to make something work that was never going to." He smiled at the crowd the way a man smiles when he's certain the audience is on his side. "The truth is, a man like me needs a partner who can keep up. Intellectually, professionally." And he paused, and the pause was deliberate, shaped like a knife, physically. Someone laughed. It was a short, quickly smothered sound, but Lena heard it. She would hear it for months afterward, in the space between waking and sleep. She didn't cry. She was too stunned to cry. She stood there in her burgundy dress with rain still drying on her shoulders and felt something inside her go very, very quiet, like the moment before an earthquake when the birds stop singing and the air holds its breath. And then she turned to leave. She made it to the lobby. She made it past the marble fountain and the Christmas garlands and the bellhop who pretended not to notice her expression. She made it all the way to the elevator bay before her legs decided they were done cooperating, and she put one hand against the gold-paneled wall and breathed. "That was the cruelest thing I've seen done in public in approximately 11 years. The voice came from her left. She turned. The man standing there was not a hotel guest. Or rather, he was, but he was the kind of guest hotels rearranged entire wings to accommodate. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with dark hair that had the look of something expensive grown out, and the kind of stillness that didn't come from being relaxed. It came from never needing to be anything other than exactly what he was. His suit was the color of midnight. He held a glass of something amber, and he hadn't touched it. 11 years, Lena said, because her brain had apparently decided that was the relevant part. "There was an incident in Frankfurt," he said. "Boardroom. A man told his business partner in front of 40 employees that he'd only been kept around out of pity." He tilted his head slightly, studying her with eyes the color of winter slate. "Your situation was worse. I'm not looking for a comparison." "No," he agreed. "You're looking for the exit, and the elevator is broken. Has been for 20 minutes. He nodded toward the far end of the lobby. "Stairwell is faster." She stared at him. "Who are you?" "Someone who watched that happen and wants you to know that the man at the podium is significantly less impressive than he believes himself to be." He said it the way people state facts about weather. Certain. Unhurried. Lena's name was Lena Marsh, and she had a master's degree in applied mathematics, a talent for reading rooms that had never once failed her at work and had apparently catastrophically failed her in her personal life, and zero patience left for men who thought they were doing her a favor by speaking to her. But something about the way he said it, significantly less impressive than he believes himself to be, made her pause. "Calloway," the man said, extending a hand. "Elliot Calloway." She knew the name. Everyone in the financial sector knew the name. Callaway Consolidated was the kind of company that didn't need to advertise because it owned the firms that advertised. Elliot Callaway was 38, a former military intelligence analyst turned private equity architect, and he was famous for two things: an uncanny ability to identify undervalued assets that everyone else had written off, and the fact that he had not, in 12 years of business, ever lost a negotiation. She shook his hand. "Lena Marsh." "I know who you are," he said. She waited for the explanation. He didn't offer one. The elevator dinged, apparently repaired, and the doors opened. Elliot Callaway held the door with one hand and looked at her. "The bar on the 14th floor is better than whatever they're serving in that ballroom," he said. "And the view is considerably less humiliating." She should have said no. She knew she should have said no. But she was soaking wet, and the ballroom behind her contained Derek Weston, and she was, for the first time in 4 years, completely out of reasons to be reasonable. She stepped into the elevator. He didn't ask her about Derek. She appreciated that more than she could say. They sat at a corner table in the 14th floor bar, and he asked her instead about her work, specifically about the algorithmic risk model she'd published 2 years ago in a quantitative finance journal. She stared at him. "You read that?" "I funded a firm that tried to replicate it," he said. "They couldn't. Your variable weighting system was more sophisticated than they realized." He looked at his drink. "I should have hired you directly. Most people don't know that paper exists. Most people aren't looking for what actually works." He said it without the self-congratulatory weight men usually brought to that kind of sentence. "Just fact. You've been underutilized at Hargrove Capital for approximately 3 years. Lena studied him. He was either the most unusual man she had ever met, or running a very elaborate game, and she had spent 6 years in quantitative analytics learning to distinguish between outliers and errors. "What do you want?" she asked. He looked at her directly, and the gray of his eyes didn't waver. "I have a problem," Elliot Callaway said, "and I think you're the solution." The problem, as he laid it out over the next 40 minutes, was this. Callaway Consolidated was in the middle of a hostile takeover attempt by a consortium led by a man named Preston Hargrove. Yes, that Hargrove, the founder of the capital firm where Lena worked, the man Derek Weston had spent 4 years trying to impress. The consortium's strategy depended on a specific vulnerability in Callaway's ownership structure. A legacy clause from a founding agreement that required a majority shareholder to have a legally recognized domestic partner in order to exercise full voting rights on acquisitions. It was an antique provision, a remnant from a 1960s partnership agreement that no one had thought to remove, and Preston Hargrove's legal team had found it 3 months ago. "They're going to trigger the clause at the shareholder meeting in 6 weeks, Elliot said. "If I can't demonstrate a domestic partnership, I lose 42% of my voting block. The acquisition goes through." "And then?" He stopped. "And then?" Lena prompted. "And then approximately 800 people lose their jobs inside the first quarter because Preston Hargrove doesn't build companies. He strikes them." She sat with that for a moment. "So you need a partner." "I need someone who can stand beside me in front of a boardroom full of lawyers and make it believable. Someone who understands finance well enough to answer questions under pressure. Someone," and here he paused, "who wouldn't be suspected of doing it for conventional reasons." "Because why would someone like me be with someone like you?" Lena said. "Not a question." He looked at her steadily. "Because why would someone like you settle for an arrangement?" The difference in those 2 sentences was the whole of it, she noticed. "What are you offering?" she asked. "A contract, 6 weeks, public appearances, 2 industry events, 1 family dinner I've been avoiding for a decade, full legal consultation on your end. And when it's over," he reached into his jacket and set a card on the table, "a position at Callaway Consolidated, structuring the risk modeling division. Salary to be negotiated, but I assure you the number will rearrange your expectations." Lena looked at the card. Then she looked at him. "You watch what just happened to me in that ballroom," she said, "and your first instinct was to offer me a business proposition." "My first instinct," Elliot Calloway said quietly, was to go back into that ballroom and make Derek Weston regret the last 10 minutes of his life. The business proposition was my second instinct. I thought it would be more useful to you. The silence stretched. I need to think about it, she said. Of course. He stood, buttoned his jacket. You have my card. I'll need an answer by Thursday. The first public appearance is Saturday. He walked away. Then, at the door, he paused without turning around. For what it's worth, Lena, he said. The man downstairs looked at you like you were something he'd outgrown. I've been in the same room with you for less than an hour, and I'm already trying to figure out how to make this arrangement permanent. He left before she could respond. She called him Wednesday. She told herself it was purely strategic. The position alone was worth the discomfort of 6 weeks of pretending, and she'd spent 4 years pretending with Derek, so she had practice. She told herself Elliot Calloway was just a man with a problem, and she was just a woman with a solution, and the geometry of that was clean and uncomplicated. She told herself a lot of things that she mostly didn't believe. The first public appearance was a charity gala at the Meridian Club. He sent a car. She wore black. Not the I'm diminishing myself black, but the I have decided to be terrifying black, and when she stepped out of the car and Elliot Calloway turned to look at her, something moved across his face too quickly for her to identify. You look, he started. Professional, she supplied. I was going to say formidable, he said, and offered his arm. Inside, the effect was immediate and somewhat gratifying. She watched people process it. The quiet calculation in their eyes as they looked at Elliot, then at her, then back at Elliot, searching for the explanation. She was used to that look. She had been used to it her whole life. The moment people decided she didn't make sense in a particular context, didn't fit the picture they'd already composed. But Elliot Calloway didn't seem to notice their confusion, or if he did, he found it irrelevant. He introduced her to people the way you introduce someone whose presence requires no justification. He kept a hand at the small of her back that was light enough to be optional and steady enough to mean something. When a man named Gareth Wyndham, a Hargrove associate with the specific energy of someone who had been sent to gather intelligence, approached them with a smile that didn't touch his eyes, Elliot stepped infinitesimally closer to her. Wyndham, Elliot said pleasantly. Calloway. I didn't realize. Gareth's eyes swept over Lena with the practiced discreetness of someone who was absolutely not being discreet. That you'd been seeing someone. That's rather the point of a private life, Elliot said. Lena turned to Gareth Wyndham with her full attention and her best boardroom smile. Lena Marsh, she said. I believe I published a risk analysis last year that your firm tried to license without attribution. Small world. Gareth Wyndham blinked. Elliot made a sound beside her that was not quite a laugh, but lived in the same neighborhood. I should circulate, Gareth said, and did. Elliot leaned down slightly, just enough that she could hear him without raising his voice above the ambient noise. That, he said, was the most elegant thing I've seen done at one of these events in a decade. I was just being accurate, she said. Yes, he agreed. That's what made it elegant. Week 2 was an industry conference. Week 3 was a dinner at a private club in Manhattan that Elliot seemed to genuinely despise, which made her like him more than was probably advisable. Week 4 was the family dinner he'd warned her about. His mother, Constance Calloway, lived in a Connecticut house that was large enough to feel like a statement and decorated with the kind of careful restraint that communicated wealth more effectively than extravagance would have. She was 63, silver-haired, and she looked at Lena the way a very good engineer looks at a bridge. Not for its beauty, but for its structure, its integrity. The places where it might fail under pressure. Tell me about your work, Constance said at dinner. Lena told her. She talked about the risk modeling division at Hargrove Capital, about the publication, about the limitations of conventional volatility assessment in asymmetric markets. She talked about it the way she always talked about it when someone seemed genuinely interested, which was quickly and precisely and with a tendency to forget that other people had to work harder to follow. Constance Calloway leaned forward. You're the one who wrote that paper, she said. Yes. I read it, Constance said. I couldn't follow all of it, but I understood enough to know it was important. She picked up her wine glass. Elliot's been talking about that paper for 2 years. Across the table, Elliot appeared to develop a sudden intense interest in his risotto. He didn't tell me that, Lena said. No, Constance agreed. He wouldn't. She looked between them, and the look carried about 20 years of maternal intelligence in it. He thinks if he tells people what he actually thinks, they'll use it against him. Mother, Elliot said. I'm making conversation, she said serenely. That night, on the drive back to the city, Lena and Elliot sat in the back of the car in the kind of silence that had stopped being uncomfortable somewhere around week 2. She liked you, he said. She was assessing me. She was assessing you favorably. With my mother, those are the same thing. He turned to look at her, and the passing streetlights moved across his face in intervals. She hasn't liked anyone I've brought home since 2016. What happened in 2016? He looked out the window. A woman who decided that what I actually needed was to be remade into something more accessible, more palatable. A pause. She spent 6 months trying to smooth out every edge I had. Said it was out of love. What it actually was. He stopped. Control, Lena said. He turned back to look at her. Control, he confirmed. You have about 47 different opportunities a day to find me difficult, he said, and you've never once tried to change anything. It's, he searched for the word, unusual. Your edges don't bother me, she said. I have some of my own. He looked at her for a long moment. I know, he said quietly. The shareholder meeting was 5 days away when Preston Hargrove made his move. It came through an article planted in a financial news outlet, sourced to people close to the situation. It questioned the legitimacy of Elliot's relationship with Lena. It noted the timing. It mentioned with careful neutrality that Lena had recently ended a long-term relationship and raised the question of whether the new partnership was strategic rather than personal. It also mentioned with somewhat less neutrality her appearance. Not directly. The language was the particular species of coded cruelty that had plausible deniability built in. References to Elliot's unconventional choice, to the surprise his associates expressed, to the way the relationship defied expectations. Lena read the article at 7 in the morning, sitting at her kitchen table with coffee she'd forgotten to drink. Her phone rang. Elliot. Don't, he said, before she could speak. Don't let it. I'm fine, she said, which was partially true. I'm going to. Elliot. Her voice was steadier than she expected it to be. I've been the unconventional choice my entire life. This isn't new. What's new is that the man who published that article is about to find out that I know exactly where his company's risk exposure is, and that I've been building a counter-strategy for 4 weeks because I anticipated this. Silence. You anticipated this, he said. You hired me to solve problems, she said. This is a problem. Another silence, different in texture from the first. What do you need? He asked. Access to your shareholder communications list and 3 hours. He gave her 5. The counter she built was precise and thorough and made 3 things clear. That the article's sources were directly traceable to Hargrove's legal team through metadata she shouldn't technically have been able to find, but did. That Preston Hargrove's own consortium had a structural vulnerability in their acquisition financing that made the whole thing legally precarious, and that Lena Marsh had been the lead analyst on a risk model that Hargrove Capital had profited from for 3 years without proper attribution. She didn't release it publicly. She sent it quietly to 4 members of the Callaway board and 2 journalists who covered corporate governance, and had been waiting for a Preston Hargrove story for a long time. The article was retracted within 36 hours. 2 board members who had been wavering moved back into Elliot's column. Preston Hargrove's legal team filed an amended position that essentially amounted to a tactical retreat. Elliot read the analysis she'd built and didn't speak for a long time. I keep thinking I know the dimensions of what you're capable of, he said finally. And then, You show me something new. The variable weighting system works on people too, she said, not just markets. He laughed. It was a real laugh, not the polished public version she'd heard him deploy at events, but something looser, more genuine, shaped like relief. The shareholder meeting was a formality. Elliot exercised his full voting block. The consortium's challenge failed. Preston Hargrove left the building with the expression of a man who had bet everything on a hand he thought was certain and watched the other player flip an ace. Derek Weston, who had apparently been angling for a position at Hargrove Capital for the past 2 years and whose entire strategy depended on Preston's goodwill and expanding influence, watched that goodwill evaporate publicly and comprehensively. He sent Lena a text that evening, a stilted, defensive thing that was half apology and half an attempt to rewrite history, and she deleted it without finishing it. She was standing at the window of Elliot's 43rd floor office when she deleted it, watching the city rearrange itself in the early dark, and she felt something she couldn't immediately name. It wasn't triumph exactly. It was quieter than that. It was the particular sensation of realizing that you had been, for a long time, operating at a fraction of your actual capacity, out of deference or affection, or the particular exhaustion of being in a relationship with someone who needed you to be smaller than you were, and that you were no longer doing that. He texted you, Elliot said from behind her, not a question. Deleted, she said. She heard him cross the room. He stopped close enough that she could see him reflected in the window glass beside her, both of them looking out at the city, and also at each other, in a way that was simultaneously direct and easier than looking directly. The 6 weeks are up, she said. Yes. The contract is satisfied. Legally. He paused. I have a counteroffer. She watched his reflection. I'm listening. The position at the risk modeling division stands that was never contingent on anything. But I'm proposing, and here something shifted in his voice, some quality of control he'd been carrying for weeks that finally set itself down. That the rest of it doesn't have to end on a schedule. The rest of it, she said. The dinners, the car rides, the way you looked at Gareth Wyndham and took him apart in 9 words. He looked at her reflection. The fact that my mother has texted me 4 times in the last week asking when you're coming back for dinner, which is more interest she's shown in anything I've done in approximately 7 years. Lena turned from the window to face him directly. The reflection version of this conversation was over. You built a strategy around me, she said. How do I know this isn't another version of the same thing? Because I don't need you anymore, he said simply. The meeting is done. The thread is over. There is no strategic logic to this conversation, and I am, his jaw tightened slightly, not a man who does things without strategic logic, normally. She looked at him. He looked back. You read my paper 2 years ago, she said. Yes. Before you ever met me. Yes. She absorbed that. The weight of it. The idea that before the ballroom, before Derek's cruelty and the hotel elevator and the amber drink he never touched, this man had encountered the best version of her work and thought, I need to find her. You're also not a man who tells people what he actually thinks, she said, echoing his mother. I'm making an exception, Elliot Calloway said. The city hummed 33 stories below them. Somewhere in this same city, Derek Weston was composing a second text she would not read, and Preston Hargrove was recalibrating a strategy that would not work, and the staff of the Hargrove Grand Hotel were probably still talking about the night a woman in a burgundy dress walked out of a ballroom with her chin up. Lena Marsh had spent 4 years making herself smaller for a man who publicized her diminishment for an audience. She was done being small. Tell me what you actually think, she said. And Elliot Calloway, who had in 12 years of business never lost a negotiation and had no intention of losing this one, did. I keep thinking about the moment Lena didn't cry. She stood in that hotel lobby with rain still on her shoulders, and she didn't fall apart. She didn't beg. She didn't chase Derek back into that ballroom to make him explain himself to her face. She just put one hand against the wall and breathed. And that, I think, is where the whole story actually begins. Not in the humiliation, in the breath after it. There's something I've come to believe about the way life responds to the choices we make, not in some mystical, invisible hand kind of way, but in the very practical way that character tends to determine outcome over time. Derek made a choice that night. He chose an audience over a person. He chose a moment of feeling superior over 4 years of someone who had quietly, consistently been the smartest and most loyal presence in his life. That choice didn't punish him immediately, but it started a chain. Every small dishonesty, every cruelty dressed up as honesty, every moment of using another person's dignity as social currency, it accumulates. Preston Hargrove did the same thing at a larger scale. He looked at Lena the way Derek did, through a lens that couldn't see past what she looked like on the surface, and that blindness cost him everything he'd spent years building. Meanwhile, Lena kept showing up as exactly who she was. That's the part I find myself returning to. She didn't reinvent herself after the ballroom. She didn't lose weight to prove a point or change her wardrobe to fit someone else's idea of what power looks like. She walked into Elliot Callaway's world exactly as she was, with her mind, her instincts, her years of work that she'd never been properly credited for. And she let that be enough. There's a kind of integrity in that. The refusal to shrink yourself in order to be accepted, that I think is rarer and harder than it gets credit for. It's easy to talk about self-worth. It's something else entirely to sit across from a man like Elliot Callaway, understand exactly what he's offering, and negotiate from a position of actual confidence rather than desperation. And Elliot? I think about him too. He'd read her work 2 years before he ever met her. He'd recognized what she was capable of before the world had caught up. That kind of attention, the kind that looks for what actually works rather than what's easiest to see, is its own form of character. He was hard and private and not particularly interested in making himself comfortable for other people. But he was honest. Consistently, sometimes uncomfortably honest. And when the moment came to say what he actually thought, not what was strategic, not what was safe, he did. What I take from all of it is this: the things we build in the quiet, the competence we develop when no one is applauding, the decision to keep going with integrity even when the situation makes it easy to give up, none of that disappears. It waits, and eventually, one way or another, it finds the room it deserves. Lena didn't need Derek to see her. She needed to stop standing in a place where she'd have to keep making herself smaller just to fit. Some rooms are too small for what you actually are. The work is figuring that out before you spend another 4 years in one.